In the 16th century, Antwerp became the international trading center in Flanders. Brugge had rebelled against Maximilian. They did not want him ruling or being the regent for ruling the Netherlands. His son, Philip the Fair, was a child and was too young to rule, and they wanted a council of leading citizens to be the regents. After they rebelled against Maximilian, and then he was able to take power again, after they had executed some of his counselors, he was not well disposed toward Brugge. And this was one reason that he put the patronage changed to Antwerp. Another reason was that the river coming from the sea was silting up in Brugge, and you couldn't get the big ships anymore, and they would dredge it, and it would silt up again. So for various reasons, Brugge lost its place as, the trading capital of Flanders. And one of the results of that was that the old city remained. It wasn't torn down and replaced with new modern buildings. And so today, Brugge is a wonderful place for tourists to go and to see all of the old buildings and of course, the art as well. So I guess it was good for 20th century people who lived in Brugge and for their economy. But very bad in the 16th century. Brugge was no longer the place to go to find patronage. Now, people moved to Antwerp. So Quentin Metsis, and you can see various spellings of his name, Massys, Metsis, Matsis. He was born in Louvain, but he worked mostly in Antwerp. Antwerp became the leading city of trade and commerce in Flanders in the 16th century. Brugge had been the international trading center and the leading city in the 15th century, but because of the waterway silting up and because of rebellion against Maximilian of Austria, Brugge lost its place as the commercial center of Flanders. Now, Quentin Metsis is quite an interesting artist because he has a great range of different types of art. He will portray traditional religious subjects, often in a very original way. Sometimes he paints deliberately archaizing paintings. Now, what do I mean by that? Old-fashioned. They deliberately look like they are Jan van Eyck or some other 15th century artist. And something else he starts doing, and one of the things that's really interesting about the 16th century is the rise of secular art. Things like landscape, still life, genre painting. Now, genre painting, the word genre just means type or sort. But when we say genre painting, it's come to mean paintings of everyday people doing ordinary things. Just people doing ordinary or everyday things. And Quentin Metsis paints some genre paintings. They usually have a moral message, as we'll see. But you can have moral messages in secular art as well. This is an example of his earliest work, which is, we often say, it's archaizing. It has ties with usually Jan van Eyck, Memling, David, sort of the influence of these artists, which he obviously knows them very well. They're updated. They're updated with things like flamboyant Gothic architecture, which we see here with tendrils and pinnacles. It's a very, very elaborate Gothic style. And sometimes with classicizing architecture and thrones. You'll also notice that here, Metsis, for example, the figures are very, very solid, very beautiful. Madonna with that oval face, that goes back to Memling and Van Eyck, but perhaps seems a bit, rounder. And then, of course, you see these deep folds for the drapery, this feeling of solidity. Here's another one. This actually goes back to a type of painting by Quinton. We're holding the little baby there, only it's been much elaborated. And you see the little putti, which we think of from Memling, and the musical angels, which we think of from Memling. But the decoration, you can see this decoration in the pedestals is very, very elaborate. In Antwerp, they later talk about the Antwerp Mannerists, artists who are taking the Renaissance to some extreme, and it often shows itself in very, very elaborate, almost fantasy, very fancy architecture. This isn't quite Mannerist, but it's the architecture is, I guess, going in that direction. It may be. But you can see things that remind us of paintings by Jan van Eyck, by Quinton, by Memling, and then he puts them all together. This large triptych of the Holy Kinship, which is often just called the St. Anne Altarpiece, because, of course, St. Anne, this is the legendary story of St. Anne, and this is really an exquisitely beautiful picture. I don't think the colors come through. They're pastels, they're softs, they really are wonderful colors, and the figures also. Some really interesting things going on here. You'll remember we talked about the Holy Kinship subject when we talked about Herkentot-Signons. So I'm not going to name everybody again. There's also Lucas Cranach painted it. It's a very popular subject. And it's the subject of the legendary extended family of Jesus. This is through the female line because, of course, Christians believe that Joseph was Jesus' foster father, was not his biological father. It was God that was his biological father, if you will. But there is a apocryphal gospel, the Gospel of St. James, that tells about the parents of Mary, and many other things as well. But it starts off with the parents of Mary, and the story is told that that Anne becomes Saint Anne, and her husband Joachim want to have a daughter, and they want to have a child, and Joachim is actually thrown out of the temple. His sacrifice is refused, even though he's very devout, because they say you must have a secret sin or God would not have prevented you from having children. And so he's goes off into the wilderness, lives with some shepherds, which we're seeing here in the left wing. And then an angel appears to him and tells him that his wife is going to be pregnant. An angel appears to her, tells her the same thing. They meet at the Golden Gate of Jerusalem. And, of course, she gives birth to Mary. Okay, that's the story in an apocryphal gospel. It doesn't say anything about St. Anne being married 3 times. We talked about where that comes from before. The people who are called the brothers of Christ in the Bible, that this was... I will say offensive to people like St. Jerome, who believed that Mary could not have, Mary was perpetually virgin, so she couldn't have had other children. And so that and naming of some of the holy women in the Bible, they came up with this idea that Saint Anne was married 3 times. And by each of her 3 husbands, she had a daughter. And the only name she could think of was Mary. So they're known, like Mary Salome, supposedly Salome is her father, although that is a woman's name, or Mary Cleophas. So they're known with their father's names attached. And so these are the half-sisters of the Virgin Mary. And they all have children, including some of the apostles, such as James and John. These are the cousins of Christ. So when it talks about the brothers of Christ, they're actually talking about the cousins of Christ, is how it's interpreted. So here we see, and there's various ways to show this. Here we see a very, I'll say, very classical Renaissance symmetrical composition. Here we see a symmetrical composition with the baby Jesus right in the center of the painting. On one side is Mary, and on the other side is his grandmother, Anne. And I said it's Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the other side is Saint Anne. And behind them, we see the husbands. Presumably the man in red is Joseph. And the 2 men on the outer side of the center wing would be the husbands, perhaps, or maybe the fathers. Not quite sure whether those are the extra husbands of Saint Anne, or some of them are the fathers of. Some of them are the husbands of the other 2 Marys. And then there's another figure which that's close to Saint Anne, so presumably that's Joachim. And then you have on either side her half-sisters and their children, just this exquisite calm, serene central panel. And of course, as you look through these very classicizing arches, you can see a dome and rounded arches, you see a very atmospheric landscape in the background. The left wing, as we said, is the Annunciation to Joachim. This is when Joachim has been out with the shepherds. You see them sort of in the distance. He's too ashamed to go back to town because he feels like God has not, God's turned away from him because he's not letting them have children. And so an angel appears to Joachim, and the angel tells Joachim that his wife Anne will have a daughter, and this is the daughter Mary. And you can see he's out there with the dog. Why is the dog there? Is he the shepherd dog, or is he the dog of faithfulness, that Joachim is always faithful to God? Wonderful dog. He actually looks a little bit like one of mine, only a little smaller. And you can see this beautiful angel with the 2 different colors, the green used for the highlighting in this kind of red violet, used as shadows. This is something we see in Florentine art and Mannerist art as well in Italy. But here comes the angel with the robes flurling, and a little bit of foreshortening here with the knee, and definitely just flying in. Here's the center. We've talked about this already, but as I can say, it's very beautiful, serene painting. I might say something about in the 16th century, the edges of the frames get very elaborate, and here you can see them curving up, and they get even fancier than this, actually. And let's just look at some of the details. We have Saint Anne the Christ child in the center, Mary, and you'll see that Anne is offering the child grapes, and the child also has a little bird on his finger. Well, I'm not sure, but it might be a goldfinch. Goldfinch were believed to live in thorns, and so were associated with the crown of thorns and with the future sacrifice of Christ. Likewise, the grapes, which refer to wine, and also there are places in the Bible where Jesus says, "I am the true vine." So they refer to the wine of the Eucharist, which is transformed into the blood of Christ. So there's references to his future sacrifice and to the sacrifice that takes place on the altar, where this would be the altarpiece. And then this fanciful landscape, some of the rock formations seem to me to be fanciful, as you look off into the distance. You might notice little decorative sculptures up there of two men fighting. And these crystalline columns, engaged columns in the beautiful marble that we see in the architecture. And of course, the gentle beauty of the Virgin and the child. And here, fashionably dressed for the early 16th century, we see one of the half-sisters of Mary and her children. This would be John and James. Some of the husbands. I think the one in red is supposed to be Joseph. And then more details of this very atmospheric landscape, very impressionistic. You have fields, you have a little Netherlandish town, and then you have the great vistas of the mountains. And here, as I say, the somewhat mannerist tendency is to give very, very elaborate and even grotesque decoration with this dragon, monster, devil, whatever it is. Yes. Two dragons and some other sort of horrific head in the middle as part of the column. And then there's very tender tender moment of one of the children offering a carnation. Carnation stands for love. And sometimes, of course, as you've heard with Hugo van der Hoos, it's a nagelbloem, so nail flower. So it could also stand for the nails of the cross of Christ. But here, since he's offering to his mother, one would think he's showing the tender love of child and mother. They're very learned children. They're studying from books. That little baby, it seems to be tearing up a manuscript, and it's illuminated too. I want to tell them to be more careful with the books, but they are interested in presumably sacred texts. The little baby already has a cross on his bib, and is presumably learning at an early age. You can see the monogram of Christ. It would be anachronistic if he did have a young cousin when he was still a baby. Obviously, there would not yet be the Christian scriptures or the IHS. But yes, you can see this is a beautiful, beautiful manuscript here. Once again, the center images. Now, one of the things that I think is so fascinating is the right wing. The right wing is showing the death of Saint Anne. There is Jesus' grandmother. It's not a subject you see very often. We sometimes see the death of Mary. Think of Hugo van der Hoos's Death of Mary, the Dormition of the Virgin. In that case, you've got all of the apostles have come to the bedside of Mary. Well, in this case, it's Mary's mother who is dying. And you see the family, at least parts of the family, gathered round. You see the Virgin Mary holding out the candle, which is part of the death rites. And the other two sisters, are kneeling by the bed and weeping. Husband's in the background. And then there's this young boy who stands up with a blessing gesture. Who's he? This is Christ as an adolescent or as a teenager. When do you ever see a picture of Jesus as a teenager? But there it is. He's blessing St. Anne, as she's dying. They don't need the priest in a sense because they have Jesus. And so he is fulfilling a kind of priestly function as well as, showing, he's blessing her. He presides over her death. One hand is on her head, and he is kind of serving as I want to say extreme unction. It's not exactly that, but essentially he's standing in for the priest who would be doing that if this were, just a scene of death in the early 16th century. So I think that's a really interesting detail. I mean, where else do you see Jesus as teenager and fulfilling, his promise that he serves as the religious leader? Now, exterior. Exterior shows St. Anne donating to the temple. In other words, she's giving alms, in this case to the temple. And we see in the background that Jerusalem is Antwerp, because we see the Tower of Antwerp Cathedral in the background. And then we see, what I told you before, Joachim is being expelled from the temple. He comes and they say, no, you must be a sinner because you have not been allowed to have children. This is God's way of punishing you. So you are not allowed to come into the temple. And he's so ashamed, he goes off into the wilderness. And, of course, the angel appears and tells him to go back because his wife will have a very remarkable child. But so these are the events that take place before the events inside. Well, I told you that Metsis paints genre paintings and paints archaizing paintings, and this is both. We have here a painting of a man counting out money, and his wife is sitting next to him with a manuscript open, and she's sort of flipping the pages and looking at the money, not the devotional text. This is from 1514, but they're wearing clothes more like the 1430s. So it's deliberately looking like long ago. It's placing it in something, maybe about 80 years before, but somewhere in the 15th century. And, it looks very Ikean. The still lifes on the shells behind the figures, beautiful vessels. This one more elaborate than the ones at Jan van Eyck. There's a 16th century glass vessel down here in the lower left. But you also see, of course, this convex mirror reflecting what's going outside. We've seen that with the convex mirror with Jan van Eyck, and reflecting the outside with Petrus Christus also. In fact, I'm looking up at the shelves and I see some things I've seen in Jan van Eyck paintings, such as the proto-rosary, as they call it, the glass beads. And, of course, the fruit. Looks like there's a candlestick there. Okay. Obviously, Ikean influence. The costumes look like they are much earlier, 1430 to 50. I think 50 may be pushing it. And it seems to be a secular genre painting. He's showing that use of the Ikean detail, of course. You can see the window is reflected, and there's another man shown because he's got a red hat on. So he's not in our view, but we can see him when we look in the mirror. And actually, this manuscript is a real manuscript. It's been identified. Now, just because it's secular doesn't mean that it doesn't have some kind of moral message. And so what is that message? Or does it have a message? Of course, is one question. Here's another painting we can compare it with, Petrus Christus's Goldsmith. And you remember Petrus Christus was influenced by Jan van Eyck. And a lot of his work, comes from Eyckian imitation. And so here we have a goldsmith rather than a money changer or banker, but he has all the accoutrements of his trade, and he has this convex mirror that is reflecting presumably what's going outside his workshop. Looking through the window, and you're seeing the street, and you're seeing people pausing perhaps before the window of his shop. So, there are it's laid out in a similar fashion with the half-length figure of the person, in this case weighing gold, presumably, and in the other case counting money, and then shelves behind them. There, I've blown that up so you can see how much detail we have here with both the manuscript and the mirror. The detail of the coins. It's not just coins, there's pearls, there's rings. And there is his wife sort of, flipping through the manuscript. So, what is this possible message here? Obviously, they're talking about spiritual and worldly values. Their focus is on money. And they have, a book that is undoubtedly a religious book. It's got a virgin and child, presumably a book of hours. And yet, not really paying attention to it. Is the money going to satisfy them in the way that their spiritual well-being could? Presumably not. So there is a suggestion of a message there. This is another genre painting by Metsis. It's called either The Unequal Lovers or The Ill-Matched Lovers. In this case, the woman is wearing early 16th century clothing. So it's not archaizing in the same way. But it certainly is not a religious painting. It's a genre painting. And it has definitely a moralizing message. You see this sort of ugly old man embracing the beautiful young lady who is very responsive to his advances, and she's, touching his chin and having him look right at her. She's using her seductive wiles. And what she's using her seductive wiles for is not because she thinks he's so great. You can see with her hand crossed over, a little idea of deception there. She has lifted his money bags and is passing the money on to her confederate, who is dressed in a fool's costume. Now, does that mean he's a fool? Well, if he pays no attention to his spiritual well-being, he would be. Presumably everybody in this picture is a fool in some way. But also, he could have been the person who's, making merry in the tavern or something, and distracting people. But at any rate, she's passing the money to her confederate, and there's that suggestion of folly. And the folly of lust, the folly of deceit, and, even the folly of the people who have been the deceivers, because, in the larger picture, what's going to happen to them. So it is a moralizing genre painting of, unfortunately, ordinary activities. And, the fact that it's not just any man, it's an old man who is somewhat grotesque and ugly. There were a number of these paintings which showed either old women with, say, a young man, sometimes marrying them because they want the old woman's money, or an old man and a young woman. And so it's suggesting that this lechery in your old age is highly inappropriate. It's folly. And it also has, of course, a very clear meaning that the sexual powers of the woman is leading men to foolishness, to the loss of their wits, and as you can see, the loss of their money as well. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that Metsis sometimes borrowed from Leonardo da Vinci. Somehow he has seen Leonardo's caricatures or grotesque faces. And this is a detail from a drawing now in Windsor Castle, the Queen's collection, the British Queen's collection, it has, I think, 5 grotesque heads on it. And this is one of them, which if you flip this around, that's the painting, that's the man. So it's very clearly taken from Leonardo. Well, he not only does religious paintings and genre paintings and can use caricatures, but he also paints perfectly realistic portraits. And so here we have a portrait of a scholar. We don't know who he is. We assume he's a scholar because he's got, his book open, perhaps the cap. He has glasses so he can read, and you can see that the glasses are enlarging the text. In some ways, think of this as a very traditional portrait, just sort of 3/4 view, half length, with a book open, and a landscape background. And in fact, as you see these arches coming around, and it seems to be that there's probably a column or some kind of pier or post behind the man. And that arrangement actually comes out of a painting by Hans Memling, the Berlin Madonna and Child, that is the center of the Benedetto Portinari triptych. The Madonna and Child's in Berlin, and the 2 side wings of St. Benedict and Benedetto Portinari are in the Uffizi in Florence. But the Berlin one seems to have been cut down a little bit because you can just see the capital of the column, and presumably there was, it was clearer how the architecture was arranged. But that particular motif appears in the young Leonardo's work, and it also appears here with Metsis. So you have the sort of rounded arches, and they almost kind of point down into the guy's head. Something else that's really unusual is instead of having the hands on the frame or on the table or balustrade or whatever it is in front of the person, one of the hands is raised up with a gesture that shows action and very good foreshortening. So he's trying to make the figure a little livelier. He's also leaning over, so one shoulder is higher, and this also gives it a little more liveliness. And then you have the beauty of the landscape background. So very solid, very naturalistic guy with that really interesting foreshortened hand. A couple of other portraits, these seem to go together. Someone we talked about before, Erasmus of Rotterdam. We think of Hans Holbein's paintings, but other people painted Erasmus, including Metsis. So he's showing Erasmus as the scholar with the books on the shelf, and he's writing. And then another humanist scholar, Peter Giels.